In this quiet corner of South Africa, an imperial legacy and a great name came to a bloody end at the hands of Zulu warriors. The death of this handsome young man shook Europe and caused millions to mourn. So who was this man killed by the Zulus in an obscure skirmish, and why was his death so important? Well, his name was Louis Napoleon, and he was the great nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Yeah, that guy. His father was Napoleon III, Emperor of France, and his mother was Empress Eugénie. We're talking proper pucker royalty here. He was in fact the heir to the French imperial throne. Let me tell you his fascinating story. Louis was born in March 1856 and grew up destined to be a soldier, learning to ride before he could walk. As a teenager, he witnessed the disastrous Franco-Prussian War. As the French army was defeated by the Prussians and his father was taken prisoner, he was forced to flee to England, where he and his family were warmly welcomed. Nice people, the Brits. Eventually, young Louis was accepted as a student at Woolwich Military Academy, the place where British engineering and artillery officers were trained. He was good at riding and fencing and was popular amongst his classmates. He graduated in 1875 and finished 7th in his class of 34 cadets. Though, as foreign royalty, he was not allowed to take up a commission after graduating, and so he returned to civilian life. When the Anglo-Zulu War began, he was 22 years old and desperate for a challenge. After the Battle of Isandlwana, where the British were beaten, he requested to be sent to South Africa. He was keen to show his appreciation for Queen Victoria and for England, and perhaps he felt that if he performed well, it would stand him in good stead to return to France and take up his rightful place as emperor, something he and his supporters were desperate to see. Eventually, after his mum and Queen Victoria lobbied on his behalf, he was allowed to travel to South Africa. But it was made clear that he was there on his own steam and was not a commissioned officer, nor was he to be allowed to do anything remotely dangerous. If he was killed, the Prime Minister knew it would be a diplomatic disaster for the British government. When Louis arrived in Durban, South Africa, he was treated like a celebrity. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of him. He quickly purchased a new horse called Percy, changed into an army uniform without rank insignia, and waited for his moment. Unsure what the hell to do with him, the British commander, Lord Chelmsford, offered him a position on his staff. Louis was a real character. He would show off by vaulting onto his horse and slicing potatoes that were thrown at him with his sword. That sword was an heirloom that had been carried by his great uncle at Austerlitz. Within a short space of time, Chelmsford found a way to offload the prince, assigning him to the staff of Colonel Harrison, who was the acting quartermaster general. The second invasion of Zululand was now about to begin, and this time Lord Chelmsford was taking no chances. The British force was a much more powerful juggernaut than that which had been stopped and embarrassed in January. There would be no more Isandlwanas. The prince saw his opportunity and quickly volunteered to go on patrol into enemy territory, using his skills learnt at Woolwich to carve a niche for himself, reconnoitring routes for the invasion column and sketching them. But he quickly proved to be a liability. Hard to control, he was desperate to kill Zulus and prove himself. Alarm bells were ringing. So in my own book, The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, or The Military History Geek's Guide to the Anglo-Zulu War, I actually quote Colonel Evelyn Wood, who says, "The Prince accompanied Colonel Redvers Buller on some patrols, and on his return from one on the 21st of May, I observed at dinner, 'Well, you have not been assegaied as yet.' 'No,' replied the Prince, 'but while I have no wish to be killed, if it were to be, I would rather fall by assegai than bullets, as that would show we were at close quarters.'" In case you don't know, assegais were the name of the Zulu spears. Now he was clearly a fire-eater, out to prove himself worthy of his illustrious ancestor. Captain Molyneux recalled in his memoirs a similar conversation. "As we rode home that day, the Prince Imperial and I were walking our horses a little behind the rest, talking over all sorts of things, while half a mile away in all directions were scouting parties of irregulars. Some days before, when out with Colonel Harrison and Bettington's men, the Prince had gone straight for some Zulus on a hill, who luckily had bolted. Reverting to this, I asked him why he had risked his life when the death of one or even a dozen Zulus would not affect the success of the campaign. "Ah, you are right, I suppose," he said, "but I could not help it. I feel I must do something." So I think that gives you a sense of his character. Chelmsford, becoming nervous, gave specific orders to Colonel Harrison that Louis was to only be allowed out of camp if he was accompanied by a very strong escort. Then, shortly after 9 a.m. on the 1st of June 1879, Louis left camp to undertake another recce. His escort was 6 members of Bettington's Horse, a locally raised cavalry unit, as well as a Zulu guide and the Prince's newfound friend Lieutenant Carey. Probably the last man in camp to see the Prince was journalist Melton Pryor. I've actually got his book right here and I want to read a quote from it. "It so happened that I was outside my tent in the morning," he wrote, "when I saw the Prince Imperial on horseback coming from the laager. As he passed me, he said, 'Goodbye, Mr. Pryor.' 'Goodbye, sir,' I said. 'I hope you will have a jolly morning.' The object of his expedition was to survey and make a sketch of the next proposed camping ground. Having seen him disappear in the distance, I returned to my tent to work." Colonel Harrison had told Carey and the Prince Imperial to organise a number of black-mounted troops from the Natal native horse to also accompany them, as these soldiers were thought to be better at spotting enemy movement from a distance. Due to a mix-up, they arrived late. The impatient prince decided to leave without them. It was quickly becoming clear that despite the Prince Imperial holding no official rank in the British Army, Carey was allowing him to take command. This was a massive mistake. But it's hard to blame Carey for it. After all, I see it in my own job. People who went to posh schools and are from money just like to assume they're senior to plebs like the rest of us, even if on paper they're not. It can be a real battle to hold your own sometimes, and sometimes it can seem easier to let them have their way. Carey was in an unenviable position. How would you have handled it? Let me know in the comments. So guys, I just want to pause for a moment to let you know that my book on the Anglo-Zulu War, which you just saw me reading, can be downloaded for free when you sign up for my mailing list over at redcoathistory.com. I've also recently qualified as a tour guide of the Anglo-Zulu War, so if you plan on visiting the battlefields, then let me know via my website and maybe we can organise something. As the morning wore on, the men pushed deeper into the apparently empty Zulu landscape. As they approached the Shotshozi Valley, hot and tired, the prince gave the order to off-saddle and take a break at an abandoned homestead somewhere here. At the time, the long grass was high and visibility would have been severely hampered. To compound this, no lookouts were posted. The Zulu guide, whose name sadly nobody thought to ask, or if they did it wasn't recorded, fetched water and the men made coffee. Everything seemed calm and relaxed, far too relaxed. At around 4 p.m, the men were about to mount their horses and leave when everything changed. Lieutenant Carey later described what he saw in that terrifying moment. He said, "My eyes fell upon a number of black faces moving through the grass behind the troopers. I saw the puffs of smoke, heard the volley fired into us, and saw the Zulus rush forward with a shout. They were then about 20 yards off. There was then a general rush. We can't say for certain, but it's likely that around 50 Zulus now attacked. They came sprinting forward with their war cries of Usutu. Some of Louis' escort were already mounted, some weren't, and immediately there was a desperate rush to escape. Louis himself seemed unable to mount his horse. His famous ability to vault into the saddle failed him at the crucial moment. He was dragged for some way holding on before he was forced to let go and to try and make a run for it. The great author and historian Ian Knight writes beautifully about what happened next. As Louis caught his breath, he turned towards a group of 7 or 8 Zulus who were by now only 20 yards away. Armed with just his revolver, Louis fired at the man nearest to him, a warrior of the Mbonambi named Habanga, who ducked down into the grass and threw a spear at close range, which struck Louis either in the chest or inside the left shoulder. The spear must have fallen out, for Louis rushed at Habanga, who turned away and dodged behind a warrior coming up behind him, a man named Gwabakana, who just moments before had stabbed Abel. Gwabakana had a gun and he pointed it at Louis and fired, but even though he was only 10 yards from him, he missed. Louis stood for a second and fired back at Gwabakana. Umwanzane, who was close enough to observe the chilling detail that a look of surprise passed over his face that he had hit nothing. Gwabakana then threw a spear which hit Louis, who promptly turned and ran towards the donga, with Habanga, Langalebelele, Dabayane and others in pursuit. Apologies to any Zulu listeners if I've mispronounced those names. As he reached the bottom of the donga, he turned to face the men behind him and fired 2 shots. more slowly, and still he hit nothing. Another warrior now appeared over the lip of the donga on Louis's right. Langalibalele threw a spear which struck Louis in the thigh, but it either fell or he pulled it out, and with this spear in one hand and his pistol in the other, he managed to keep his attackers at bay for a second. One of these warriors, Umpalassi, wrote that he saw the prince seize Langalibalele's assegai and wield it. Langalibalele said that he hit the prince first and on the thigh. I saw the prince twist as he turned to face his pursuers. He then advanced quickly on Habanga and paused only on seeing a Zulu approach him on his right rear. When he fell, he had an assegai in his right hand and a pistol in his left. He had just tried to change them from one to the other. In defending himself, he put his left foot into a hole and slipped a little, and then the men rushed on him. And so, the last hope for restoring the Napoleonic dynasty was dead. This was a big moment for all of Europe. The Zulu warriors, true to their traditions, cut open the prince's stomach. This was a practice known as haka, and was to allow the dead man's soul to escape. A number of the warriors then repeatedly stabbed the prince in a ritual called homula. Finally, those involved in the kill stripped him in order to wear his clothes. This is a practice known as zila. His sword, that amazing family heirloom carried at Austerlitz, was taken and later given to the Zulu king Cetshwayo. He then returned it to the British as a peace offering. Alongside the prince, troopers Abel and Rogers of Bettington's horse were killed, as was the unnamed Zulu guide. Their graves can still be visited today. I was there last year and took these pictures. This stone was also placed to commemorate Louis, whose body was removed by a party of the 17th Lancers the next day and eventually returned and buried in England. Lieutenant Carey and the rest of the survivors, shocked and depressed, raced back to the British camp. While there wasn't realistically much they could have done to save the prince, the lack of action, their inability to regroup and return to look for him, all very much weighed against them. Lieutenant Carey was now about to face a terrible storm. How's this for bad luck? As soon as he approached the camp, the first men he found were those two fire-eaters, General Evelyn Wood and Lieutenant Colonel Redvers Buller. Buller asked why Carey looked so shaken. "The prince is dead," he replied. Buller asked where was the body and how many men had he lost. When Carey couldn't answer, Buller, a bear of a man, told him he should be shot. Now I can't help but feel a little bit for Carey. When the alarm was raised, it was a case of every man for himself, and in the spare of the moment he made the wrong call. I'm sure that he later wished he had died alongside the prince. His career was as good as over. He was later court-martialed and sent back to England under arrest. But his conviction was overturned, and he eventually returned to his regiment, the 98th, only to die of disease in India in 1883. For more on the Anglo-Zulu War, be sure to subscribe and watch this playlist.